Thank you very much. It's a great privilege to be here at the law school. This is my first visit here. Seems to be a great institution. Thank you to our previous speakers for their wonderful remarks about the protection of freedom of religion or belief abroad, such important areas, and both of you have made such important contributions in the defense of freedom of religion and of human dignity generally. I can't begin without first paying tribute to Senator Orrin Hatch. Could we imagine a successful conservative legal movement in this country without him? I certainly couldn't. Senator Hatch has been such a consequential leader when it comes to reaffirming our country's commitment to limited constitutional government. He was a real fighter in the Senate when there were few voices calling for a rededication to the proper role of the judiciary in our society. Senator Hatch, you've had an enormous impact on at least 2 generations of jurists and lawyers, and we all owe you a tremendous debt of gratitude for that and for so much more. Thank you very much. My purpose today is to touch upon 3 topics that are often addressed separately, but that I believe need to be tied together. My proposition is very simple. It is ultimately impossible to bolster the freedom of religion without respecting and enforcing the structural limits on government power contained in our Constitution. And the judicial selection enterprise we are witnessing today by appointing structural constitutionalists will do more than most imagine to preserve the freedom of religion. But before we consider that current enterprise, we should step back and briefly consider the past. 232 years ago, our nation's founders gathered to preserve the rights they had fought so hard to secure and to save our young nation from anarchy and failure. They succeeded. The gift they gave us enabled the miracle of America, and the Constitution was then and is now the greatest charter of liberty ever written by human hands. The genius of the Constitution doesn't lie solely in the words that fill it, though they are brilliant. Nor does it lie mainly in the institutions the Constitution created, though they are remarkable as well. The real genius of the American Constitution lies in the space between those words and the clash between those institutions. There we find the principles that give our system life and verve: the separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, enumerated powers, and the sovereignty of the American people. This is what I call the structural Constitution. It is the built-in restraints on government power, without which there would be no real protection for individual freedom and no real respect afforded to the dignity of the human person. It is what James Madison referred to when he spoke of ambition being made to counteract ambition, and the need for external and internal controls on those who wield power over the nation. Without the structural Constitution, we would only have the ring of words and lofty promises. The Bill of Rights, including the freedom of religion contained therein, would be little more than a wish list, a mere parchment barrier. That it is not is testament to the wisdom of our founders and the system that they gave us. In this respect, America is truly unique, and the American people are truly lucky. When I was chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, I went to some pretty grim places where liberty was little more than a mirage. I heard high-sounding boasts about the rights that governments respected, the United Nations declarations they signed, and on and on. But I saw rank and cruel persecution, where rights were denied because there were no meaningful limits on government power. Outside of small house churches in Indonesia, state security officers photograph worshipers who are then targeted for discrimination. Buddhist monks in Vietnam and China are swept up from the streets and detained. Visit a coffee house in Pakistan, northern Nigeria, or Egypt, and there is a decent chance you'll encounter a Christian or a minority Muslim with a story of being beaten by a mob for his beliefs, while police stood by and did nothing to help. Even the Soviet Union had a long list of guaranteed freedoms, so too does North Korea today. Every tin-ear dictatorship and president for life recites the human rights that it supposedly respects, but only the United States and a couple of other countries have constitutions that give the fullest possible force to human freedom. The structural Constitution is the framework for so much of our national success. When our leaders in courts have upheld that structure, America has flourished, with ample space for churches and other institutions at the core of civil society to improve the human condition. But when this structure has been undermined and damaged, the American people have paid the price through the slow and steady decline of liberty in all its forms and the corresponding rise in the size and scope of the government. It is no coincidence that here at home, so many threats to the freedom of religion are rooted in a decision to cast aside the concept of limited constitutional government. The contraception mandate that beset the Little Sisters of the Poor is ultimately the progeny of a statute that has no warrant under the limited enumerated powers of Congress under Article 1 of the Constitution. The Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority retaliated against an employee who sought to observe Passover, and its only defense was a sleight of hand argument that is a byproduct of the fact that this agency structure simply cannot be squared with the separation of powers. If principles of federalism held sway and Congress refrained from improper delegation of its lawmaking power to a boundless administrative state, there likely would have been no need to come to the rescue of an Indian tribe that was the subject of an illegal undercover raid to confiscate fallen eagle feathers used in its religious ceremonies. Look at any number of incursions on conscience rights and the free exercise of religion, and often you'll find some departure from the structural limits on government power as our founding fathers understood them. But we are at the threshold of a very exciting moment, one which should give advocates of religious liberty some real hope. For the first time in my lifetime, I think for the first time in any of our lifetimes, the Supreme Court is close to reviving the structural Constitution. After decades in the wilderness, a majority of justices may soon regularly enforce the limits on government power and recognize the separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism, and recognize them not as quaint aspirations, but as concrete obligations. And as a result, we are on the verge of an era where the federal judiciary is again the friend of the American people's freedom and not our foe. We have never been so close to a recognition that if the mission is truly to protect freedom anywhere, then you are in the business of restraining the powers of government. This in turn helps to ensure a fierce independence that refuses to be ordered about, pushed around, or told when your faith is welcome and when it's not. Limiting government power naturally opens up space for a vibrant civil society, and religion is at the center of that civil society. This state of affairs, Less government and more robust private ordering or civil society is the most of American qualities. Not long ago, the legal momentum for that balance was basically all on the other side. Those days of losing in the courts of law by default are becoming more rare. But that doesn't mean that we can't still lose politically or culturally, or that defending religious freedom or our other liberties will ever get easy in the courts. One reason is this: while intolerance toward religion is not as heavy-handed as it is in other cultures, it's something arguably more disarming and insidious. It is fashionable. Just think of the Little Sisters of the Poor. Recall the superior attitudes directed at the Little Sisters during that controversy. For most of us, when we consider some of the most selfless people on earth giving everything and asking for nothing, the feeling we get is not one of superiority in any conceivable sense of the word. Yet that's how these nuns were treated. These loving sisters, so filled with grace in the legal case that concerned their rights of conscience against a contraception mandate in the context of health insurance benefits. In all the comfortable corners of elite culture here in the United States, who defended the Little Sisters? Where were the indignant editorials speaking up for them and denouncing the previous administration for its needless and obvious overreach? We get earnest lectures all the time about respect and protection for minority views in our diverse country. But the silence in this case conveyed a familiar message. You just have to hold the right minority views. Otherwise, well, you're on your own. The court fortunately did the right thing despite these cultural trends. Now, in all of this, I think we see two trends at work in the culture that here again I've noticed in other countries as well, which is what makes me nervous. The first is how freedom of religion, which implies hard legal protections, is amongst elite opinion in society giving way to what I would call a looser, airier concept of freedom of worship. The right to worship sounds very broad and generous, but it's narrow in consequence when you pause to think about it. The emphasis is all on belief and formal observance, leaving the rest a wide open question. Freedom of religion has a much more tangible meaning. It protects the right of conscience, not just in houses of worship, but in workplaces and schools and hospitals and government offices and anywhere else we go in this world. The short of it is that we should not be deceived by effusive talk about the right of worship, because it has an agenda not at all friendly to the real right of conscience guaranteed by the First Amendment. And we need courts to reject this trend. And there's a second trend that follows from this. As government policy becomes more grudging toward religious freedom, that attitude naturally spreads in the broader culture. A hostile stance in Washington creates space for groups with kindred ideological designs. We see this today in coercive tactics and nasty rhetoric directed against companies known for their religious and moral standards. The thinking of these activists seems to be, if the government's going after those companies, why shouldn't we? It just takes a little imagination to see where all of this leads if you let it go unanswered. Freedom of conscience, after all, is not exactly one give-or-take item on anyone's list of human needs and aspirations. What is closer to the heart, or more essential to our identity, as the Baroness mentioned in her remarks? Give an inch in defense of conscience, and you can measure your other losses in yards. A government that suffocates something so elemental as the freedom of religion is not likely to be respectful of any other right. Now, fortunately, I believe President Donald Trump is committed to appointing principal jurists who will interpret the Constitution as it's written, which means defending the structural Constitution and interpreting the freedom of religion and other Bill of Rights guarantees as the framers understood them. Just over 2 years ago, I heard the president-elect lay out his expectations regarding the judicial selection process. Listening to him, I couldn't help but think that we were being charged to identify nominees who embodied the 4 cardinal virtues. We were basically told to find men and women who would be, first, prudent, having what St. Thomas Aquinas called wisdom concerning human affairs and right reason with respect to action. We needed to look for those who would do justice, giving to each his or her rightful due in light of every person's natural equality before the law in the eyes of God. We had to find people who would model temperance, who are moderate in thought and deed, and humble enough to know the limited role that belongs to a judge. And finally, we were tasked with finding leaders who were, in the president's words, not weak, who would forsake outside influences and the fashions of the day, and who, when the criticism came, as it surely would hold fast to the fixed meaning of the Constitution and stand immovable in the midst of dangers because they possess the most important of the virtues, fortitude. The president is consistently appointing judges with this kind of character, and the Senate is doing its part to confirm them swiftly. For my part, I believe that nothing else this administration has done or will do is more important than this. And judging by the reaction from the other side, I suspect the left agrees. Now remember, the left's agenda is fundamentally incompatible with the original meaning of the Constitution. They need courts that give Congress a free pass when it oversteps its enumerated powers. They need justices who see no problem with giving more authority to the administrative state, that fourth branch of government that has little constitutional legitimacy these days. They need judges who avoid the inconvenience of competing and even contradictory decisions in the states as dictated by federalism. And most of all, they need a Supreme Court that places no limits on its power. A court that doesn't just issue rulings, but acts as the supreme ruler of the nation. A court of kings and queens in black robes, uncheckable, unaccountable, unstoppable. Attacks on constitutionalists will only worsen in the days ahead as we continue to make progress to restore the structural Constitution. But I think we can take heart that where once we were beaten, as in the nomination of Judge Robert Bork, now we have the infrastructure and the intensity required to persevere. We know what to expect and how to confront it, which is why Clarence Thomas and Brett Kavanaugh are on the court despite the ugly, underhanded attempts to stop them. Even so, we cannot stand still or rest on our laurels. The moment we do that is the moment we begin to fall behind again. And for the sake of our Constitution and our nation's future, we must press forward. Now is the time to further sharpen our arguments so that more and more Americans come to understand that limited constitutional government, those structural protections and restraints in our Constitution, protect the dignity of every person, regardless of race or gender or religion or class. This is at the very core of why we should defend the structural Constitution. If you care about religious liberty or any other Bill of Rights protections, you've got to stand up for the structural Constitution. Now is the time to engage the culture with renewed vigor, training a new generation of opinion leaders, scholars, and lawyers who will carry this message and this movement further than ever before. And now is the time to renew our conviction that we are in the main of the great American tradition. Our eyes are fixed on our sacred birthright of liberty, and we are striving to preserve the best of our nation's past for the benefit of America's future. Ronald Reagan spoke of our country as a shining city on a hill. George W. Bush spoke of our nation as the strongest, freest, and kindest nation on earth. These statements are true because of the structural Constitution, which gives the American people the room to be exceptional, to be who they are, to be what they are called to be by their Creator. And when Benjamin Franklin stood outside Independence Hall and declared that we had a republic, if we could keep it, he was calling on all of us in every generation to preserve the framework that he and our founders had so painstakingly crafted. Consequential leaders like Senator Hatch, have answered that call, and decades of work have brought us this far. Now let us stand together and stand courageously to finish the task that we are in until we dedicate our courts and then our country to the Constitution of the United States. Thank you all very much, and God bless you all.